Welcome back to the pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Mike Connell, COO of Nthought, about the growing skills gap in R&D in life sciences as advancing technologies become more broadly implemented across industry, and how such technology shouldn't be seen as a panacea. The possibilities might be considerable, but what must ever be held in mind is that these technologies are not human, do not have all our capabilities, our subjective capabilities at that. Rather, a system must be engineered for integration that adheres to quality control and reliability and all due safety and accuracy processes. For the training in and implementing of advancing technologies is a process of shifting left and turning science into engineering, in a sense. As ever, thank you for listening. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I'll be speaking with Mike Connell, PhD and COO of Nthought, about the growing skills gap in R&D in life sciences. Nthought powers digital transformation for science, seeking to help science-driven companies fully realize the competitive advantage and business success that can be achieved from digital transformation. Indeed, 90% of its global technical team have advanced STEM degrees, with 65% holding PhDs, and are fluent in the language of science, passionate about solving the toughest challenges, leveraging advanced technologies like artificial intelligence or AI and machine learning or ML. Nthought was founded in 2001 when CEO Eric Jones, PhD, was conducting research at Duke University. Jones recognized the potential of the Python scientific software stack to solve tough science problems and remove much of the drudgery experienced by technical experts. To harness this potential, in 2002 he gathered about 50 like-minded scientists at Caltech for what would become the first annual Scientific Computing with Python, or SciPy, conference. Over the past 20 years since, quite a while then, Nthought scientists and engineers have made numerous significant contributions in scientific software. These include creating the original SciPy package, creating the initial scikit-learn package, founding the HDF5 for Python or H5Py software project, co-creating OUQ theory, and creating and maintaining WXPython, a cross-platform GUI toolkit. So, when we think of the skills gap, this isn't a new concept. Over 70% of engineering and R&D companies struggle with talent gaps, but while technologies like generative AI or Gen AI, you might have heard of it, can help, they may actually exacerbate it in the short term. That's why it's critical that organizations implement frameworks for getting scientists and engineers up to speed quickly. And as you'll hear from Mike, this can be done through a process called the 80-20 rule. So before we begin upon our theme, Mike, perhaps you could kick things off by telling listeners a little bit about yourself, about your journey to today, and what you do with Nthought.
Certainly. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so my deep background started out in AI and machine learning within computer science as an undergraduate, but I was really interested in human learning. And so after that, I kind of explored. I started out really in cognitive science. I did computer science and AI as a focus area for my interest in learning. And it was interesting because I did the machine learning models really to understand human learning as opposed to how they're mainly used now, which is for kind of modeling and data processing. So that was very interesting back then. And then I kind of moved through cognitive science, psychology, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and then into education, really as an application domain as an application domain for all of that stuff that I had done. So, for example, my dissertation in education was really looking at how do we translate insights from neuroscience and cognitive science into practice within education but also I've applied it more broadly to management and leadership, to marketing. The same kinds of principles can apply broadly. So all of that background, sort of technical background, plus this kind of human side and a lot of work in training and development and education kind of led me to Enthought, where I started out organizing or leading the training function. They had a robust training business. And then when we pivoted to doing digital transformation for these science-based organizations, for these R&D organizations, all of those skills were useful because it really is a socio-technical kind of transformation that you're doing, right, between the people and the processes and the data and the technology. And so you need all of those skills together to design programs and consult on those kinds of things.
Thank you. I like that expression, socio-technical transformation. Rolls off the tongue quite well. It doesn't really. So to start with then, Mike, can you perhaps, let's go straight to Gen AI. Can you explain the current ways that Gen AI is being used in drug discovery and development, including approaching some of the current misconceptions about Gen AI use in life sciences?
So you can kind of think of it at different levels. At the individual level, I think that people in the drug discovery and development process are using chatbots and those kinds of and co-pilots really to support a lot of different tasks, right? Administrative work, using some scientists are doing, they need to write algorithms or use code for various things. So they can use something like GitHub Copilot to facilitate that. I mean, that is one of the challenges of certainly on the R&D side, is that you are faced with a lot of different kinds of problems that require the use of a lot of different kinds of tools. And their work is extremely enhanced by access to digital technologies, whether it's, scientific computing, machine learning, cloud computing, scalable compute, all that kind of stuff, database access. And so the problem is that when they're trying to do their work, they hit all this incidental complexity, as we call it, which has nothing to do with the scientific problem they're trying to solve, but has everything to do with, they're not certified as an AWS engineer, or they don't have a background in computer science and Python. So that's one of the things that generative AI can do, is it can kind of hide a lot of that incidental complexity through things like a copilot. So it's called intentional programming. You can describe in English or even in the language of biology what you're trying to accomplish, and the generative AI can come back and say, well, here's an algorithm that will do that for you. That's a tremendous enhancement to the kind of work they do. So I think that's the main thing that happens around, say, the scientists within R&D, and also throughout the pipeline, using things like chatbots to do administrative tasks, writing emails, summarizing documents, as well as, kind of more being a Swiss Army knife kind of thing for the R&D side, where they have to solve all these multifaceted problems that involve a lot of different kinds of tools and technologies. So I think that's kind of the main thing that's happening at the individual level. And I think since this is so new still, that's where a lot of the current activity is. There are more, what do you want to call them, more organized efforts, of course. People are now doing experiments and building out technologies to using generative AI to do things like extract information from documents. A big part of the work here is to find hypotheses and new ideas for targets and things in the drug discovery process. And so that's a very laborious process that requires a lot of human intelligence and is very subjective. And so, they have to go through patent documents one by one and read them and make sense of them and then try and extract insights. They have to go through literature that's coming out, new articles that are published. So that's an area of a lot of intense focus, is how do we leverage generative AI, which can take this kind of unstructured data and you can query it and say, give me all the molecules that have, that do X, that do some function. That's a big area of interest. And I think there's investment there. And I think there's been some progress there in some organizations. And then there's also a lot of work around using, generative AI models like AlphaFold 2, which can predict, structure from sequence. And so that's really important for a lot of drug discovery and development. And so being able to not have to do bench R&D, right, where you go and it's very expensive. It can take a year to map one of these things manually in the lab. And so if you can actually have a generative AI where you give it the 100,000 data points that people have already mapped collectively, right, and then it can predict any of 200 million structures from sequences, with more or less fidelity. So that's one of the things is we have to continue to refine those models. But in principle, that's a huge win, right? Suddenly we accelerate the whole thing. And so, yeah, people can kind of look up answers or they can search through this space of possibilities. So that's, AlphaFold 2 in particular and other things like it, Molar and some of these other predictive models like that, those are being used already in practice as well. So,
thank you, Mike.
Yeah, those are kind of three different categories.
You've been discussing enhancement, prediction capabilities, all the very positive things. So I was just wondering, when it comes to Gen AI and misconceptions around Gen AI, it's a lot of hype, but is there myth rather than reality behind the hype sometimes in certain applications with Gen AI?
Yeah, definitely. I think one general principle is that it's Amara's law, right? People tend to kind of over predict what's possible in the short term and under predict what's possible in the long term. And the way I think about that in this case is that people look at something like a chatbot, ChatGPT, and they say, wow, it can do everything that a human can do. And it's got all the knowledge of humanity. And so it must be able to do anything that any human could do. So there's a misconception there because it's only as good as the data that it has. And it has a lot of language data, but it doesn't have as much data around protein folding, for example, right? You have to do that one specially. So that's one source of myths is people kind of extrapolate from the surface features or the surface behaviors of these chatbots and think that they can do anything that any expert human could do. That's not true. Where they underestimate what's going to happen in the long term is they aren't looking at sort of the affordances, right? The generative AI brings certain capabilities and possibilities, potentials, and they're not all embodied in a chatbot. And so it's really those affordances, things like having this ability to hide incidental complexity because I can express my intent in English and it can do very complicated technical things on the back end without me having to know how to do those things, like, set up a server at AWS or write an algorithm in Python. That's an affordance. And so, who knows what people will do with that affordance in the end. It's not in the chatbot. So that's one of the reasons that we kind of see some of these myths come up. So I think, some of the myths that we see do derive from that. Like people think that, well, it's as good as a human. And so an expert human. And so we should just be able to throw all of our current data at it or plug it into our current data sets, and it will be able to work with all of that proprietary data magically. That's not the case. You actually, in reality, have to build data infrastructure. You have to have, checks on your data quality. In fact, what organizations probably really need to do if they want to use AI like this is they need to think about their data differently, and then they need to restructure how they collect it and store it and curate it and all of that. Because right now, many labs, the data is kind of the exhaust from the research process. It's I'm trying to solve a problem. Like, I want to design a protein or something. And so I'm doing all these experiments and that generates data. And the data is sort of a side effect of the process. And I use it to make decisions, but only in the context of that project. And then later, if I'm going to do a similar project, it would be nice to know what I did before. So I either don't repeat it or I can get some insights from it about what worked and what didn't work. A lot of organizations just don't collect the data in that way for secondary analysis, right? They don't treat the data as kind of a first class object that's useful for things like feeding an AI. And so sometimes, often, typically the data aren't even complete. Like human scientists will check something at a certain stage subjectively and say, oh, that's a good one or that's a bad one. And those data are never captured anywhere. And so for the AI to actually have a full data set to be able to do what the human does, you have to change the way that you're collecting data. So there's a myth there that we just kind of throw any data at the machine and it will make good sense of it and extract huge insights out of it. That's a big myth that we see a lot. Yeah, kind of related is that there's this idea that, because again, I think of the way that chatbots work and how incredible they are, really. This is a huge breakthrough. It's an inflection point, I think, for real. But it also gives the impression that that something like a chatbot or that a generative AI, a foundation model alone can do everything. And what's interesting is that these are very different. These generative AI technologies are very different from other kinds of AI or other kinds of technologies, which you might call engineering technologies. It's almost like something that's kind of fallen from space, like an organism, and we have to probe it and poke it to figure out what it does and what its limits are and all of that. It's not an engineered technology. And so that's the myth, is that, oh, it just works because it's like a human or something, but is a fully capable human able to do anything? It's not. And it captures a really important piece of human intelligence, which is quite general, right? It can reason about a lot of different kinds of domains given the data it's been trained on, but it doesn't have all of the capabilities of a human. And so, for example, humans know how to check their work. Humans know how to check other people's work. Humans sometimes have panels to kind of, if something's ambiguous, if a problem is ambiguous and we can't come up with a clear answer, we build a panel of experts and they argue it out. None of that, generative AI doesn't have any of that capability. It'll just confidently tell you its answer, even if it's a complete hallucination. And so, that's kind of the myth, is that they can just do anything out of the box, but they can't. And in fact, they aren't fully functional like a human being, or, They don't have all of the capabilities that one would need. So you have the point being that the myth is that it's ready to use out of the box. The reality is that you have to engineer a system that integrates it in a way that basically meets all of your requirements for quality control and reliability and validity and all of that stuff. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you. So at least at this junction, not a panacea, as it were. Keeping the human element in there as well. I noticed you mentioned a few times subjectivity of the human being, the subjective creature, if you will, going back to your definition of an organism for Gen AI from outer space, which is slightly terrifying as an idea. But going back to subjectivity, with subjectivity, there is the risk with this data that's being fed into such technologies with bias, though, isn't there?
There is. And it's not an easy problem, because as we saw with Gemini, trying to correct for that can actually make the problem worse. Yeah, it definitely is a fundamental problem, but it's also a fundamental problem with humans, right? That's one of the interesting things about these technologies, is that, like I said, we've figured out a mechanism which is based on how humans do it. It's not just a kind of other forms of AI, like the original chess playing machines. They don't play chess the way humans play chess. They don't operate the way humans operate, right? And so this is the way that humans operate fundamentally. I mean, it's not a perfect model or anything of how our brains work, but it's the same kind of mechanism. And so it inherits all these incredible capabilities that humans have to do inference and summary and all of that. But it also inherits a lot of the limitations fundamentally. And so that's one of them, right? Is that it's, it develops its intelligence based on the data that it's given. And so that's kind of baked in there. So it's something we need to guard against, but it's not at all clear how to, because like I said, you can make the problem worse by trying to correct for it in, I guess you would say, naive ways.
Thank you, Mike. So I want to turn now to this concept of how, namely how organizations can best prepare their data and their employees for the integration of AI and advanced technologies. I want you, in short, to tell us more about this 80-20 rule for bridging what is veritably a widening skills gap.
Yeah, so there's some infrastructure things, of course, and then there are, I think it's infrastructure and include data in their process, like the work processes, the workflows, the business processes, and then there's, the capabilities, the human capabilities. And I think, part of what we're seeing now is we've got all of those structures in place. And so those initial uses that I described, they're enhancements on the current order. And so over the longer term, what we're going to see is you have to restructure the order, because the relationship of the human to the technology, to the work, should change quite dramatically. And that means that the data infrastructure and the data, the work processes, and the capabilities are all going to need to change. So in terms of the data infrastructure, I already kind of alluded to the change there. It's a paradigm shift from thinking about data as exhaust, a side effect almost of your research and development process, to the fuel that drives that process. And so that means some specific things, like you probably should automate the data collection. You need to make sure that the data are complete, which they typically are not. That means including not only all of the measures that are necessary to kind of characterize whatever it is you're working on, right? The molecules, the processes, the recipes, all of that stuff needs to be captured and codified. But it also means you need all the metadata, and that metadata needs to be appropriately connected, which often it's not, right? Because a lot of these things are done manually. And so people write things down on paper like, oh, this sample ID, and then they do a bunch of experiments, and maybe they store the data in Excel for the experiments, but the sample ID is somewhere else. And so that's metadata that allows you to link all those data together. So you fundamentally have to think about your data, like I said, as a first-class object, which is a valuable strategic asset, which is not only used to run this one experiment series and get your answer to your research question now, but is used for secondary analysis and as part of your growing store of knowledge. And organizations do this more or less well, right? Some do it really well, some do it incredibly poorly. But most are not doing it to the level that they should to support this kind of, AI work. I guess at the next layer, the processes, part of what you want to do is you have to examine the processes in light of the constraints that were in place when you built them. So these processes that we run today were largely built around the assumption that humans are the central processing element. And so you see things, for example, where the expense is. It might be that you've got one step where people are kind of running a process where they're looking at hundreds or thousands of iterations of a process to find, a molecule or a functional site on a protein or something. That might be because it's so expensive, downstream to test each one of those things that you try and kind of generate as many as you can and filter them out early. I'm making this up on the fly as an example, but you might want to shift. You know what I mean? If you have the ability to look things up, then maybe you don't need to do it that way. Maybe you could take one and carry it all the way through and evaluate it. If you have AI and you've got models all along the way, and you know what I mean? The point being that the way we've structured the process today is because of where the cost and the risk and the kind of expense and frankly, the expertise bottlenecks are. And that distribution changes dramatically when we bring generative AI or AI generally into the picture. And so one of the traps that people fall into is that they assume the process is the process, and they then try to kind of layer on the technology or the capability of AI. And so you end up getting incremental gains instead of transformational gains or exponential gains. So that's what's going to need to happen in the process, is revisiting it in light of the new constraints instead of the old ones. And then in relation to that, so people, that's an interesting one, because I think one of the things, people are going to need to know about AI, right? They're going to need to understand how to use AI. If it's a chatbot, you need to know how to do prompt engineering. Or for scientists, one really useful tool that not many people know about is this idea of an AI playground, where you can actually use human language to iterate with the AI to say, for example, I need to extract this complex data from this PDF. I don't know how to do it. The AI can try it, and then you can say, well, that's not quite right. I need you to do this until you get it right. And then it'd say, okay, now apply that to this 1,000, PDFs. That's a playground where you can actually kind of develop a tool using language, and it'll figure it out. And once you get it right, you can kind of turn it into an automation or something. It's a really powerful tool for scientists. They'll need to know how to do that kind of stuff, right? And so those are some skills. What they will probably need a different level of knowledge of some of the tools that they use today. Like if you need to know all about database administration to get your data out, and you need to know all about Python to write the algorithms you need, and you need to know all about AWS to be able to kind of set up a server, or you have to go hit expensive resources in IT to do that, then those are bottlenecked. You can't, innovation gets stalled because the source of innovation is all these creative ideas that engineers and scientists have on the line. And so the question is, what's the right set of skills to remove all that friction? That's one way to think about it. And so with generative AI, if we can teach people to use that, they probably need some knowledge of things, let's say like Python and databases, but they don't need the level of knowledge that they would need today to do it on their own. So that opens it up quite dramatically. And then the other thing that really people get fouled up on is there's this idea of an interface between functions or roles. And so that's a good example of one, is if a scientist needs to get data and they don't know how to use a database or SQL or whatever the language is that's required to do that, they have to go to IT. That's an interface. You have to go between the domain person, who's the biologist, and the technical person, who's the IT person. And so that's something that people often don't think about, is they think about, what roles do we need here? We need like the AI expert and the biology expert and the IT expert. The problem is you've created interfaces between all of those people, and somebody needs to do the translation between them. And so that's one thing we need to think about as we build capabilities is who are the translators and what do they need to be able to translate between? And I think generative AI helps with that because it acts as a translator when we're talking about hiding that incidental complexity. That's essentially the function that it's serving, but then getting it back to the person. Sometimes if they need to check whether it's correct, right? They always have to do that validity check. Then they're going to need to know a certain amount as well. That's where the 80-20 rule comes in is what's the 20% of anything, whether it's database administration or, cloud computing or writing algorithms in Python, what's the 20% that the scientist needs to know in order to be able to do 80% of what they need to do? And the goal really, in my mind, is to enable them to have an idea and to operationalize it in a prototype at least so they can try it out and either discard it or carry it forward. And then they can hand it off to somebody who can, do more with it, like write an application, whatever they need to do. So it's really that's the sweet spot that we need to figure out in the new world, which is what is that set of skills?
Okay, so thinking about the new world, thinking translation-wise, future-wise, what, in your opinion, Mike, will be the next use of Gen AI in the life sciences industry? And how do you predict AI technology being integrated into workflows in, the coming year, 5 years, 10 years is too far ahead probably for this kind of developing technology?
Yeah, so I think one idea is this idea of shifting left. So like I said, workflows are set up the way they are because of constraints from a human-centric design, right? Where humans were the main computing kind of elements in the system. And humans are expensive and they're limited, they're bottlenecked. And so, right, because you only have so many experts. One of the things that happens is you end up with a lot of drugs or candidates that don't succeed further downstream. And so you want to shift those failures left if you can. And so generative AI has the possibility to do that. This is the kind of thing we're seeing with AlphaFold 2. You could generalize that to other kinds of pieces of the design problem. Not everything is a protein kind of folding problem, right? And so, but you want to shift that stuff left so that if it's going to fail, you figure that out much earlier in the pipeline. And so the basic affordance here, I'll use that word again, the basic affordance, I think that over the longer term, that's really going to be important is that for the first time, we can actually have an operational, usable model of the logic of biology. And there are many logics of biology, right? Protein folding is one logic. Enzyme reactions is another logic. And so you can model these, though, in a way that people have tried to do in the past using, say, physics and stuff, but both that's slow and it's very complex at the chemical molecular level. And so these generative AI models can actually extract the logic of something like protein folding at kind of a higher level, and then they can generalize it. So we can give them 100,000 data points, and they can generalize to a much larger set of protein structures. So that's going to give us the ability to shift things left so that we can fail fast instead of waiting until we get to clinical trials. And it's also, in a sense, going to turn science into engineering, where right now, when you're designing a drug, you essentially have what's kind of an engineering problem in the sense that you're trying to design something for a function. That's really an engineering kind of problem. But in the middle of it, at the core of it, is a science problem, which is a trial and error discovery process. And that trial and error discovery process is slow, it's expensive, it's risky. And so what you have is the science is embedded in the engineering in a sense. What I think generative AI is going to allow us to do is to refactor that whole approach where you've got a set of people who are mapping the design space, the problem space. They're the ones who are figuring out what's the model that kind of tells us how all the proteins fold or how all of these, chemicals react or whatever. Those people will be mapping those parameter spaces. And then you'll have a set of engineers who will be using those as kind of almost like, how you've got those engineering books where you kind of look up parameters or you look up values. It's like kind of a giant lookup table. And so you can kind of search those models for the answers to your engineering questions on the line when you're doing the drug development. So you can kind of separate the science from the engineering, and then both of them can become much, much faster. And so, at some point, speed becomes, it's not just a quantitative gain and like, oh, things are faster. It leads to qualitative shifts in what we're capable of doing. Like the cost goes so far down that you could, essentially come up with a drug for any disease, which currently is not the case because it's too expensive to the population for some. Or, we can reach parts of this. We can solve problems about diseases that currently are too complex or they're too hard for humans. Like those things come within reach. So I think it's those two things. There's a kind of a notion of shifting left, and then there's this notion of turning science into engineering, which I think those are kind of the longer term outcomes of where we're headed with this stuff.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.